Hi, welcome to our last chapter of this course called Astrobiology. Astrobiology is the study and search for life on other worlds. Before we actually do that, in this first part of the video, we're going to talk about life on Earth because it's important to understand the basics of Earth-based biology before we can even start to dream about thinking about what life might be like on other worlds. When we talk about life, there are some big questions, and what we're going to do in this chapter is make sure that we leave these questions to the questions that science can answer. In other words, the big questions of life that are understandable or answerable by science, this is the role of science in the study of biology. So, for example, what is life? What is the origin of life? Where did all the species of life, including ourselves, humans, come from? Are we alone in the universe? So all of these questions can only be answered with science based on physical evidence. These are not religious or philosophical questions or arguments. Now, there are many other important questions that are not answerable by science. For example, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? These questions cannot be answered by science, and we probably never will be able to answer those questions with science. These questions are answered in the context of religion, philosophy, art, poetry, and even music. So we're going to deal exclusively with the scientific version of studying life and answering the questions about life, and so that is our goal of this part of the lecture. So all life forms on Earth are based on carbon chemistry, and carbon chemistry is sort of the backbone of the DNA and RNA molecules that carry all of the genetic information for everything that's alive on Earth. And this can range from the simplest life forms, such as some virus, which have very simple RNA strands, to something very complicated and complex, like this organism here. The human organism has a DNA molecule that, if you stretched it out, all of the DNA in our bodies, it would go back and forth between the Earth and the Sun about 30 times. So obviously there's a huge difference in the complexity in the various forms of life on Earth. So the key to life on Earth is DNA, and all the information that guides all the processes of life are stored as basically instructions, almost like a recipe, inside of our DNA molecules. And all species have the DNA as well, which are different. DNA consists of 4 building blocks, which are amino acids, and they're called adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. And they're usually abbreviated A for adenine, T for thymine, G for guanine, and C for cytosine. So we'll talk about the structure of this DNA molecule on the next slide. But basically, the ordering of these pairs of amino acids in this DNA molecule determines the specific instructions and information that is encoded in the DNA molecule. So the DNA molecule, it's a long spiral ladder-like kind of shape. It looks like a twisted ladder, and this is called a double helix. And the information, genetic information, is stored by the code of base pairs. And the base pairs, it's either T with A, and remember T, A, G, and C are those 4 amino acid bases. So T is always with A and G is always with C, but the order of these base pairs can vary. And so it's sort of like these are letters of the alphabet, and by arranging them in different orders, we can make words, or in this case, instructions for the organism of, and inside the cell for what the cell is actually going to do. So for humans, we have about 3 billion base pairs in each DNA molecule. So imagine this ladder here, this twisted double helix spiral ladder with 3 billion steps. And all these steps, the different ordering of the steps, whether it's T and A or G and C, will determine the various instructions and information that's embedded in this molecule. So obviously, with 3 billion letters in the instruction set, obviously there is a lot of information that could possibly be coded in here. The human DNA molecule is more than 1 meter long. If you were able to reach into one of your cells and pull out the DNA and actually unwind it, it would be about 1 meter long. The sections of the DNA become blueprints, and these blueprints again are sort of like a recipe that tells the cell what to do to form proteins, enzymes, and do other functions inside the cell. So the DNA molecules are coiled up in tight spirals, which make up chromosomes, which contain genetic material. And genes are segments of the chromosomes controlling certain functions and traits. So for humans, we have 46 chromosomes. 23 come from your father and 23 from your biological mother, and we have an estimated 25,000 genes in our genome. The key thing for DNA is duplication and division. So what the DNA molecule can do, and this is sort of way oversimplification, but basically it can unzip itself and into 2 pieces, and then those 2 pieces rebuild themselves step by step. Remember all those base pairs. So they can rebuild by chemically attaching to the appropriate base pair to make 2 copies of itself. However, the interesting thing here is because the DNA molecule is so complex, the 2 copies are usually not identical. There will be some slight variations which are called mutations, and we'll talk about those next. And the key thing about these mutations, keep in mind, is this allows evolution to take place. So the DNA molecule it can divide and basically make a copy of itself, which is called replication. But when this happens, the 2 copies are not always identical. There are some errors. Now, these errors are rare, but they can occur, and these errors are called mutations. So remember, this DNA molecule has to restructure itself with 3 billion steps along the way here. And so out of those 3 billion steps, occasionally, 1 or more are not going to come out perfectly, and this is going to be a mutation. So mutations can be caused by random base pairing errors, or damage from radiation is another cause of mutations. Some mutations have no effect at all. There is apparently plenty of redundancy in the DNA molecule in that not all of our genes are active. So if some of those genes mutate, it really wouldn't have any effect on us at all. Other mutations are extremely harmful and can be fatal to the organism. Some examples are severe birth defects that actually cause death. But the ones that are interesting from our standpoint in this chapter are the mutations that cause variations. Variations are the key to evolution because some variations may provide an advantage for survival, and those variations are more likely to be passed on to the next generation. So over time, variations that are favorable for survival will tend to stick, and the species will adapt and evolve with its environment. So we're going to look at that next, how that process works. The leading pioneer of the modern theory of evolution was Charles Darwin. He is arguably one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. His early years, he studied a lot of different fields: medicine, theology, geology, and biology. But really, his main passion was he was a naturalist. He observed and collected specimens of living and dead plants and animals, and made comparisons, took notes, and so forth. And so most of his work that led to evolution happened during a 5-year voyage around the globe on a ship. And on this ship, they would stop at various places, islands and different continents and so forth, and he would collect specimens and take notes and compare what he saw. So in 1838, he came up with this idea that all the species have common ancestors, and a process called natural selection drives the evolution of a species to adapt for survival. So this is in his original notebook. He wrote, I think. This was his original hypothesis, and he was showing here sort of a family tree. I don't know if this was the finches that he studied or if it was lizards, but the idea here is that there was a common ancestor here, and that ancestor, its generations of offspring, basically went along different paths in the evolutionary cycles here and led to speciation, meaning different traits and different adaptations caused these ancestors to actually branch apart depending on where they lived and the environment that was driving their adaptations. But in the end, there were a whole bunch of different related species of this original ancestor down here. And this is the idea of modern evolution driven by natural selection, which we'll look at in a little more detail next. So let's take a look at evolution by natural selection, as this is perhaps one of the most important and greatest theories that we have in science. The idea is that organisms must be able to adapt as environment changes. So if, for example, if the climate is changing due to an ice age, where it's getting colder, a lot of snow, a lot of ice, and so forth, obviously some species are not adapted to that type of climate, but ice ages don't happen overnight. They're gradual changes in the climate. So over time, species that are living in these cold regions will start to adapt and develop, for example, more body fat to keep them warm, thicker fur, maybe lighter colored fur for camouflage in the snow, and things like that. And this is not, again, going to happen overnight. But the idea is adaptation for survival. So natural selection is Darwin's theory of evolution in which some random variations are favorable and others are not for the survival and or reproduction of the species. Thus, nature will select these favorable variations over unfavorable variations and pass them on to future generations. So one way natural selection is often described is survival of the fittest. Whichever variation of a species is more fit to survive in its environment and its surroundings, it will obviously have an advantage for survival and reproducing and passing on those advantages to the offspring. So the key thing about natural selection, and this is often misunderstood, the variations themselves are random. Some variations are good and some are not. So for example, if we're talking about polar bears, many years ago, polar bear offspring might have had variations. Some of them might have had thicker fur and some of them thinner, lighter fur. Well, obviously, if a polar bear is going to be adapted for living in the Arctic regions where it's very cold, the thicker fur is going to be a favorable variation. So those offspring with slightly thicker fur would definitely have an advantage. Now, that doesn't guarantee its survival, but it gives it a head start, basically. And in nature, any group of organisms, basically, that have a slight advantage over another organism, in the long run, they're going to have a much, much greater chance of surviving. Now, here's where people often misunderstand the idea of evolution. The variations are random. So a lot of people say then, well, then evolution is just random and by chance, and there's no way a human being could evolve from some lower life form by chance. Well, it didn't. The reason for this is that natural selection is very non-random. Natural selection is the driving force for evolution. And the reason for this is that nature selects the best variations and kills off the unfit. So again, this is survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is not a random process at all. If you have, two different organisms in the same environment and one of them has different traits than the other, well, those traits may give that organism an advantage over the other, and in the long run, it's going to have a much, much greater chance of surviving and reproducing. So evolution is not a random process at all. It is driven by the powerful force of natural selection, which allows survival of the best adapted organisms. And as I mentioned before, the theory of evolution is the basis of modern biology, and it's one of the greatest theories in all of science because it explains basically our origins. It explains where all these wonderful and diverse species that live on this earth today, it explains where they came from. So again, the idea behind natural selection driving evolution is survival of the fittest. And basically what this means is survival of the fittest means the best chance to pass on genes. So survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily mean the biggest, fastest, strongest animal is, most likely to survive. Now, that's certainly the case if you look at predator and prey type relationships. When, with the cheetah has evolved, obviously, to be an extremely fast and sleek hunter, and its prey, like the gazelle, are also extremely fast and sleek. They have co-evolved in what is called an arms race to become these basically super athletes of the natural world. So in this case, obviously, a faster cheetah probably is going to certainly have an advantage over a slower cheetah. But there are other fitness levels that don't really have anything to do with strength or speed. For example, reproductive advantages such as being able to attract mates is also a huge advantage. So, if we think of the peacock, right, the male peacock here, it has this, crazily ornamental and huge, beautiful tail. Now, this tail doesn't help it fight, or it doesn't help it fly. It doesn't make it stronger, or it doesn't protect it. The tail is purely for looks. It's for attracting mates. And by doing this, this peacock, over time has developed this sort of attractive reproductive advantage to attract mates, and this is going to be an advantage for passing on its genes. So in both cases here, this is survival of the fittest, meaning the best chance to pass on genes and reproduce. So let's take a look now at some examples of evolution. And again, this is something that we really can't do justice here in just a few minutes in a couple slides. This is something that is studied in entire courses, for biology classes and biology majors, but we'll try to cover some of the highlights and interesting points here. So let's start at the beginning and look at the early evolution of animal life on Earth. Now, the thought is that life on Earth started with organic molecules, and we'll show that these are very common. Not only in the early Earth were they common, but we actually can even see these in space. Organic molecules exist inside of comets, and they've been detected far away from the Earth. These organic molecules can link together to form more complex organic molecules such as proteins. Now here's where we really don't know how this all started yet, the very beginning here. The origin of life, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this video, is still sort of a mystery. Well, it still is definitely a mystery. But our best thoughts at this point, our best hypothesis, is that some of these proteins began to self-replicate. In other words, they could reproduce themselves by dividing and chemically rebuilding themselves, just like modern DNA or RNA does. And once this process started, then this was the beginning of life, because evolution could take over and small variations in these copies would be selected by nature because some of them were more fit than others to survive. So from there, the cell evolved, and then multi-cell animals and some of the earliest life forms on Earth were probably related to modern day sea sponges. and worms. And worms, you can sort of see a progression here as the worms, these were certainly sea worms, not on land yet, and they began to swim, developed fins, and we eventually ended up with the early fish, which was around 350 million years ago. So from fish, there was an interesting transition that took place about 400 million years ago, and that is a transition from sea to land. So this is the evolution of fish to amphibians, and this is well documented by fossil evidence. So the early fishes here, one thing to kind of watch is that the fins of the fish, especially these lobed finned fish, they're sort of fleshy fins here, they basically developed into legs over time. And you can see this progression here where the fins become legs, and we end up here with early amphibious creatures. These are the first amphibians about 350 million years ago. A couple of examples here that are interesting. This one here is called Tiktaalik. It was an amphibious fish that lived about 375 million years ago, and as is shown in this, here's the actual fossil of it. It probably lived both on land and in water like a modern frog or salamander might do, and it had fins here that were used for either walking in shallow water or perhaps even on land. So it's considered to be possibly one of the first species that actually left the water and started to live on land, and its ancestors certainly did. Interestingly, there's a modern amphibious fish called a mud skipper, and it can walk from pond to pond on land to get from one pond to the other. So, it's sort of a cross or a link between fish and amphibian. And there's a living fossil called a coelacanth that was thought to be extinct for 100 million years or more, but it was found that these fish still live in the ocean today, and it has these lobed, what they call lobed finned or fleshy fins here that are reminiscent of modern legs on amphibians. One of the other interesting examples of evolution is the evolution of birds from dinosaurs. So I won't go into all the details here, but basically the modern birds that we have alive today descended from a branch of the dinosaurs. And this is showing some of the evolutionary steps that the modern bird took to get where it is today. And one of the famous sort of links between dinosaurs and bird is the Archaeopteryx, which was basically a feathered lizard. And I don't know, and I'm not sure if anybody really knows if they could fly per se, but they certainly probably used those feathers to flutter around maybe on the ground. And this is also showing the evolution of the bird wing over time here. And we'll talk about this these slight changes here in anatomy to lead to different structures. That'll be the subject of something in a few slides later. So where did modern mammals like ourselves come from? Well, modern mammals evolved from a branch of reptiles called the therapsids, which were mammal-like reptiles, and this was about 260 million years ago. So these are showing some skeletons here, some fossil skeletons of early mammals, and also what they perhaps looked like. So these are some, again, this is kind of, you can sort of see it's sort of a cross between a lizard and a rodent. The evolutionary story of the whale is very interesting because remember that animals evolved first in the sea and then moved to land, but the modern whale went from land and returned back to the sea. So the ancestors of modern whales were actually land animals like this Pakicetus. It was terrestrial. But look what happened over time. The whale's, basically its limbs started to adapt more for swimming over time until we're back to modern day where the whale, which is of course a mammal that lives completely in the ocean now, its limbs are basically fins for swimming. One thing that's interesting about the whale's evolution is that you can see the hind legs of the whale basically disappeared over time. In fact, the pelvis and the hind limb are called vestiges, or they're vestigial structures, and these are sometimes still seen in modern whales. In other words, they still have sort of a clue from the past. They have a pelvis and hind limb, or like you can think of it like a thigh bone, that's basically just floating inside their anatomy, and it's not used at all. It's just a reminder of its ancestors in the past, which walked on four legs. And of course, the most interesting story of evolution is the evolution of primates and humans, because this is the story of ourselves, where we came from and who our ancestors were. So the first primates showed up approximately 60 million years ago. So in the history of the Earth, this is a fairly recent time, and this is, for example, this is after the extinction of the dinosaurs. The earliest primates were, you could think of them as probably small, maybe squirrel-sized, squirrel-like, shrew-like rodents that almost certainly lived in the trees for protection, so they were arboreal. You can see sort of the evolution of early primates into monkeys and apes. Here's an early ape 20 million years ago, and then one branch of these eventually evolved into our direct lineage of ancestors, and these were the early hominids. Certainly these were not humans by any means yet, but several million years ago our ancestors probably looked something like this. And then over time our ancestors evolved into modern man, something like in the last 100,000 years. You would definitely call our ancestors then human. This is showing the evolution of the human skull over time. These are some actual fossils taken here, some diagrams shown down here, and this would be over the last probably roughly 2 to 3 million years, showing the evolution of the human skull and head to modern humans over here on the right. So you can see there are just subtle and gradual variations in the structure of the jaw, the forehead, and also the brain, the cranium size increased over time. One of the very important pieces of physical evidence that makes us confident in the theory of evolution are called homologous body structures, because they indicate a common ancestor. Let's take a look at the forelimbs of 4 different mammals. So here's a human forelimb, or what we call an arm. So the bones of our arm, the humerus is the upper arm bone, and then we have 2 lower forearm bones, the radius and the ulna, and then in our hand are the carpals, metacarpals, and also the phalanges, or our digits or fingers. Now look at the forelimbs of a cat, a whale, and a bat. Now obviously a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat are all very, very different if we think about, what these physically, what these species look like. Obviously they're all mammals, but actually, despite their extreme differences when at first glance, once we look inside, we see that things are very, very alike. In fact, they're almost identical. Every mammal has the same set of bones in the same sequence and order. So for a cat, it's pretty easy to see the similarities between the human arm and the cat's arm. But even in a whale's flipper, the same set of bones. This is the humerus. This is the radius and ulna. These are the carpals and metacarpals. And then the phalanges, or the, which are fingers or digits on humans, are extremely long and stretched out. But even the bat has these same bones that have been modified and adapted for flight. So here we have, a cat walks on its forelimb. The human uses its forelimb for making tools and so forth. The whale uses its forelimb for swimming, and the bat uses its forelimb for flying. So 4 very different functions of these limbs, but they're all made from the exact same parts in the same order. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is simple. All 4 of these species here, human, cat, whale, and bat, all share a common ancestor. And that ancestor's offspring over time split amongst different branches of the evolutionary family tree and evolved into the species they are today. But we can still see the remnants and the hints of that common ancestor that had the same bones seen in all four of these examples. This is an interesting diagram here called the tree of life on Earth. And keep in mind, this is just a small section of a much larger tree of life because it only shows a few species up here, not the hundreds of thousands or millions of species that exist on Earth today. But the idea here is with this tree of life is that all these modern species up here, and they're grouped into plants here, fungi, these are all the animals, including arthropods, reptiles, and mammals here. You can see humans are shown right here. And then over here are fish and starfish. All of these modern species here, if we trace them back, we can see they eventually link up with other species because these are the common ancestors of these species. So for example, all of the reptiles, including snakes, lizards, iguanas, crocodiles, and others such as turtles, they all come back to a common ancestor here for the entire group of reptiles. Likewise, all the mammals share a common ancestor. The placental mammals, such as humans, have a common ancestor, and then the marsupial mammals have a different common ancestor. But one thing is interesting here is the farther back we go, the more these groups start to join together. For example, all of the animals share a single common ancestor at some place in the past. All of the plants share, if we keep going back and back and back, they all share a single ancestor, that we're going back billions of years now, but all the plants have a single ancestor that produced all of the diversity of plants today. And the proof for this is also in the DNA. And this is what biologists study. Evolutionary biologists look at this on a molecular genetic level and can see the similarities between all of these species and actually trace their lineages back. But what's fascinating about this is that any two species on Earth today share a common ancestor. So even all the plants and all the animals over here are linked together by a single common ancestor, which may have been a single-celled organism early on in the evolution of life. So what this means is that if we take humans and let's say a fern, or a plant that you find in the forest, well, if you go back far enough, you will find a common ancestor from a human being and a fern. So this, is kind of a really fascinating and wonderful thing to think about. If you trace back your own lineage to your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and so forth, if you kept doing this for millions and perhaps billions of years, you would come back to an ancestor which makes you basically a distant cousin with every other animal on Earth today. So every insect, every tree, every lizard is basically a distant cousin from ourselves. We're all related in that we all have a common ancestor if you go back far enough in time. Now, how far back can we go? Well, the idea here is that everything on life, we think, has a single common ancestor, and it could be traceable back to a single replicating molecule. But we don't know about this last step yet because we don't know how life actually started. But once it did start, we're very confident that all life is basically related according to this tree of life. So this is a summary of the evidence for the theory of evolution. The fossil record, which I didn't really talk about, shows very plainly that earlier fossils show simpler life forms. In other words, the oldest fossils on Earth don't show life forms that had They weren't vertebrates. In other words, they didn't have bones inside their body. They had exoskeletons, for example, or they didn't have bones at all. So that's the idea of a vertebrate and an internal skeleton. This showed up much, much later on the evolutionary scale. And so the fossil record shows that over time, life became more and more complex, which is certainly what is predicted by evolution. I mentioned vestigial or non-functional organs and structures. The fact that we have tailbones and even toenails and fingernails, what are those? Well, they're leftover remnants from our ancestors. Our ancestors had claws. Our ancestors had tails. And we still have these structures inside of our anatomy, even though they may not be useful for our survival anymore. I talked about whales still having vestigial thigh bones present in their anatomy. Snakes still contain a pelvis because the ancestor of the snake was a lizard-like ancestor that had hind legs and needed a hip bone or pelvis to support those legs. Modern snakes, of course, have lost their legs, but they still have these remnants of their ancestors inside their anatomy. There are transitional and intermediate species both in the fossil record and amongst living animals. Biologists study the geographic distribution of species. In other words, species that got split apart by mountain ranges that formed, or when the continents drifted apart. Species were split into two groups, and each of those groups evolved separately since the climate might have been different on one continent than the other. So by studying the distribution of the species, biologists can form a complete lineage of these species back to common ancestors. Obviously, there are similarities between related species. We talked about some of that already. And we can't see evolution over a long time frame because we just don't live long enough to see it. Evolution takes a long time. It takes thousands or usually millions of years. But we can see what is called microevolution, and this is most easily observed in microbes. So this is microbial evolution. For example, bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, and you hear about this a lot, that a lot of the antibiotics that we give for infections are no longer useful because the bacteria have evolved and adapted, and as a result we have these antibiotic resistant bacteria. Viruses also mutate. We hear about colds and flus mutating. And mosquitoes have also evolved against insecticides and so forth. One of the interesting stories that you may hear about is the use of antibacterial soap in your kitchen or bathroom. And at first glance, it sounds like it's a good idea because antibacterial soap kills 99% of the bacteria in your kitchen. However, think about the 1% of the bacteria that survive. Those bacteria are probably better suited against that type of soap. So those are the strongest, most fit bacteria. So what we're really doing is we're sort of helping those bacteria by eliminating the weaker bacteria and allowing the stronger ones to reproduce and multiply. So in some sense, there is some controversy. The use of antibacterial soap may actually be more harmful than beneficial. The main evidence for evolution is in the DNA, and this is at the molecular genetic level. And so this is something that is beyond the course here, and is certainly beyond my expertise. This is in the realm of biologists to study DNA and genetic evidence for evolution. And then finally, we talked about the homologous anatomical structures. For example, here again, this is the skeleton of a bat. And these bones, every bone in this bat skeleton matches a bone in a human skeleton. And they're all in the same sequence. They're all in the same place. So what this tells us is that humans and bats both came from a common ancestor long, long, long ago. And one branch of that ancestor's lineage evolved eventually into bats, and the other one ended up with humans. But there were lots of other steps along the way. If you're interested in learning more about evolution, because it is a very fascinating subject, these are two excellent books for non-scientists that I would recommend. Particularly this more recent one, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution, is really good and will basically give you a very good understanding of modern evolution and lots of examples for it. This chart is an attempt to show a summary of the timeline of fossils collected for life on Earth. And so the idea here is, over here, that we start over here on the left and we kind of move to the right to modern day here. Fossil evidence tells us that life on Earth began in the sea at least 3.5 billion years ago. So remember that the Earth is approximately 4.5 billion years old. So life was already on Earth during the first billion years. We don't know exactly when it started, but by 3.5 billion years ago, life was definitely on Earth. And the earliest life form are these fossilized stromatolites, or they're called. And they're basically sort of matted layers of bacteria that form sediments, basically, and become fossilized. And so these are the earliest recorded fossils that we have on Earth. Some bacteria-like microbial life forms that existed during the early life. So the idea here again is that life forms begin very simple and they evolved into more complex forms over time. And we can see that here with simpler animals here eventually evolving into more complex forms, including modern mammals way over here on the right side. The first fossils of land plants and animals appear about 400 million years ago. So this was when plant and animal life left the sea and began to colonize the dry land. And this is, relatively recent. This is only in the last 0.4 billion years. So in geologic time, that's not that long ago. So let's now talk real briefly here about how life actually started, the origin of life on Earth. And this is one of the great mysteries in science. We know that the fossils are telling us that life began approximately 4 billion years ago in the sea. I just talked about those fossils that were 3.5 billion years old. But the question is, how did life actually begin? And unfortunately, we don't know, but we do have some clues. So there is a term here, abiogenesis, is the natural process by which life arises from non-living materials such as organic molecules. So let's look and see how this works. A famous experiment called the Miller experiment was conducted back in 1952. And what Stanley Miller did here is he wanted to recreate conditions on the early Earth and see basically if the Earth could produce the materials and molecules necessary for life. So what he did was he had a sealed chamber here. You can see it here as well. And inside of that, he put gases that were thought to exist in the early Earth during the first stages of Earth's evolution. And he put those gases in this sealed chamber along with water and heat, basically, and he had electrodes inside here to create a spark discharge. In other words, he zapped this gas. So this would simulate lightning in nature. So basically, he wanted to get a lot of energy into these gas molecules and see if they would react together and what would happen. So he let this thing run for a while, for a few weeks, and amazingly, the experiment produced some fundamental building blocks of life. Inside of this chamber, after he let this thing run for a while, there was sort of this slimy goo on the deposited on the glass walls. It contained 20 different amino acids. And remember, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins that are inside of our body. It also created fatty acids and urea. So these are complex organic molecules. So the water and with oceans and primitive atmospheric gases and energy from lightning could create these building blocks of life. Now, he did not create life. Life has never been created inside of a laboratory. However, he did produce very easily. He showed that building blocks, the raw materials needed for life, could be produced and were probably very common on the early Earth. So the Miller experiment showed that the basic building blocks of life form naturally. Remember all those amino acids that were discovered there. And the thing about these complex organic molecules like amino acids, they're carbon-based and they tend to be very reactive with each other. In other words, they can link together to form growing chains of organic molecules here by linking together all these amino acids. So the idea here is that the early oceans on Earth and maybe tide pools on the shores were probably filled with a rich mixture of organic compounds, and this is sometimes called the primordial soup. You can just think of this goo and sludge and slime just covering the bottom of the ocean, covering maybe the tide pools and the beaches and so forth, but nothing alive yet. But all of the materials for life are here and they're ripe and ready. So chemical evolution would lead to the formation and survival of the most stable of the more complex compounds. So some of these molecules would break apart, others would not because some are more stable. Life may have begun when these molecules began to replicate themselves. And what that means is they split into two copies, like a modern DNA molecule, and those two copies then basically rebuild themselves chemically to make two copies of the original. But there would be slight variations in the copies, and this would lead to evolution. These variations or mutations would allow some of these copies here to have different characteristics and be more likely to survive and reproduce and replicate themselves. So this DNA, this early DNA, would have a mindless determination to survive based on natural selection driving it.